Hi class, welcome to lecture 1.2 on business organizations. First we're going to discuss the role of the financial manager. The first thing you need to know about financial managers is they're trying to answer the three financial management decisions that we discussed in lecture 1.1. For reference, you may remember that these three financial management decisions are capital budgeting or long-term decisions, capital structure or debt versus equity decisions, and working capital management, also known as short-term decisions. Although the top person in any company is usually considered the president or CEO of that company, the top financial manager is usually considered the chief financial officer. Underneath them is usually a treasurer and a controller. The treasurer is going to manage cash and credit expenses, financial planning, a lot of the things that you will actually see us talk about within this class. The controller, on the other hand, is going to handle a lot of the financial accounting for the firm, cost accounting for the firm, taxes, maybe even some information system data processing. The chief financial officer, depending on how big a firm is, may do all of these services, or the firm may be broken down even more into finite jobs for every specific person within the company. Nonetheless, the chief financial officer is the person that is probably going to be signing the checks and monitoring all the cash flows. As you can see from this corporate organization chart, the CFO is usually directly under the CEO, but they may also be underneath the COO or the Chief Operations Officer. However, the buck doesn't necessarily stop at the CEO. There's also a board of directors over them that can usually hire and or fire that CEO, and that board of directors is actually has many people above them depending on how many shareholders are within a firm, because usually a board of directors is elected by the shareholders. So you could actually have drawn another box above the board of directors. But as you can see, if you go back to the CFO position, it is broken into treasurer and controller, and then you see quite a bit of jobs under each one of those positions as well. Once again, the focus of this class would probably be more representative of those four positions underneath the treasurer: a cash manager, a credit manager, capital expenditures, and financial planning. Now that we've talked about the typical organizational chart for a firm or business, there are also three different major ways that firms or businesses are formed in the United States. The first is a sole proprietorship. Sole proprietorship is basically just starting one business by yourself, such as creating a lemonade stand, a t-shirt company, or even starting your own tech company. As long as one person's involved and they own the whole shebang, it's a sole proprietorship. Partnerships are when more than one person comes into play. There's both general and limited. A general partnership is when both people come together and kind of share the risk and play a major role in the company. A limited partnership is more when one person is going to manage the company and the other person kind of fronts up the money to get it started. We'll talk more about partnerships in a minute, but the main, difference between general and limited is liability concerns. Corporations are what you've probably heard of when you hear about most companies. Very few companies stay private as a sole proprietorship and then become very well known. But they are a distinct legal entity that are owned by one or more people or other entities, and so in some ways they almost have the same rights as a citizen within the United States. We'll talk about many different types of corporations, but two special types. There's the S Corp, which is a special type that can limit self-employment tax. It has to do with how many different shareholders you have. You cannot have more than 75 shareholders or owners. And one of the major reasons that you would look at a S Corp is for some interesting tax consideration. An LLC, or a limited liability company, you've definitely should have heard of that acronym. LLCs are usually more flexible for profit sharing, and this is one of the major ways that companies are formed in the United States. Now to look at each one of these forms more specifically, let's start with sole proprietorship. There are more sole proprietorships than any other business type, yet they're not very well known, or not as well known usually as corporations, because they're usually smaller, and as a company grows they usually become a partnership or a corporation. In other words, most big corporations like Facebook or Twitter or any other corporation that you want to think about once start out as either a sole proprietorship or a partnership. If you're interested to see how a company like that might start off, you could look at the movie Social Network, and it'll show you how Facebook eventually became what it is today. Once again, these are just simple companies like lemonade stands or t-shirt businesses, or can be very advanced companies like IT tech firms that you eventually want to maybe even sell out down the road, that venture capital might be interested in, or what. But once other people become involved, you no longer have a sole proprietorship. Now let's look at the advantages for a sole proprietorship. There's a lot of good news. They are very simple to start. They've got very few regulations. They allow the owner to keep all the profits. And then also all business income is treated as personal income, which is a really big deal, meaning that the business owners for a sole proprietorship are only taxed once. There are a lot of disadvantages to sole proprietorships as well. For example, it helps to live a long life because a sole proprietorship is limited to the life of the owner. It also helps to be extremely rich, since venture capital is limited to the owner's wealth alone. So another way of looking at this is, if you only rely on your own wealth, then you may miss out on new opportunities that you could have used to grow your firm, but you would not do so because you would not rely on having another partner within the firm. With this being said, it also helps to be extremely smart and a very good manager, because you, as the sole proprietor for your company, you cannot afford any big mistakes. Creditors can take your personal assets, meaning that you have unlimited liability, and in this case it can be very dangerous for you if you have a whole lot of other wealth, and then you come into a company and this company gets sued for whatever reason. They may not just go after the company's assets, they may go after your personal assets as well. You could also say it might help to have kids or somebody that you love, a spouse or partner, because selling ownership is not easy. It can't be broken into a lot of parts. For example, I remember when I was doing financial planning, I was looking at a sole proprietorship for a tugboat company in Alabama. And one of the more interesting issues that arose during the financial planning was, how would they divide up this company for the kids? They had two kids. One kid really liked tugboats, and one kid cared nothing about the business and wanted to have whatever inheritance they were going to get through the business sold. Now, how do you go about selling that? And it's not like you can just put a tugboat on the market and get it sold that day. They're not the most liquid assets available. So there's a lot of issues that can come up with trying to transfer or sell ownership or interest within a sole proprietorship. Another example is my family owns a lot of tree farms. Well, if you want to make money off of tree farms, it requires a lot of patience. You have to wait until those trees are ready to be cut down. You don't want to cut them down too prematurely. However, if somebody wants to take their part of an inheritance on tree farms and sell it, well, they have to try to sell it to somebody that understands the value that these trees will become when they sell, and you have to decide to break down property, and breaking down property across fair property lines is not always easy to do as well. So sole proprietorships are not the easiest companies to sell ownership interest. Moving on to partnerships. Partnerships are similar to sole proprietorships, but there are two or more owners. Now, one of the major advantages this creates is that there should be more capital available because there are more people. Now, sometimes this can lead to a general partnership, and sometimes this leads to a limited partnership. What's the difference? Well, limited partners are hands off. They don't participate in the business, and because of that, their liability is usually limited simply to their financial contribution to the partnership, meaning that if something happens, they cannot be sued or have any of their personal assets taken away. They can only be sued and lose their financial contributions to the company. General partners, on the other hand, have full liability, and both of them, or however many there are usually very hands on within the company, knowing that they have a lot at risk from both a financial commitment and also from a liability perspective. Now, if you will look, there's also some interesting things with what happens to the partnership if one or the other partner were to die. So as you can read up on the slide, it says partnership dissolves when one partner dies or wishes to sell. So once again, there can be some tricky issues involved with a partnership and what would happen from an inheritance perspective or from a perspective that at some point one of these partners may want to sell their interest. Now, moving beyond the sole proprietorship and the partnership, we go to the corporation, which is completely different than the other two. First, a corporation is defined as a legal person distinct from owners and a resident of a state. In other words, it can have the same rights, duties, and privileges of an actual person. For example, it could borrow cash, it can sue or be sued, it can even sign contracts. So a corporation is a really interesting invention, so to speak, of the American dream that we've created over the last couple of centuries. So, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages? Well, if you can't think of the biggest advantage, then let me inform you. The main reason that you would want to become a corporation is cash. It is the easiest way to raise capital or to grow cash so that you can grow your business. An example is GE has around 10 billion shareholders or shares outstanding and around 4 million shareholders. So that right there should tell you that GE grew into the corporation it is today from an equity contribution by so many millions of shareholders. Beyond cash, let's take a quick look at some of these different advantages. Limited liability is huge. If I am also an owner of GE. That might surprise you, but I own a lot of companies in America. I only own a few shares, but nonetheless, I am still an owner. I have very limited liability in these companies, meaning no matter what happens, who gets sued, whatnot, the most I could lose is the stock value within the company. So whatever my shares are currently selling at, they could go all the way down to zero, and I could lose that entire amount of not only my original investment, but any capital appreciation as well. Which sounds bad, but that's a lot better than getting sued and having people come after my personal assets. Now, they also have an unlimited life, and this is really interesting because, for the most part, a corporation can technically live forever. Now, usually corporations may change names or get bought out or merge with something else and create a new name, but nonetheless, they can live forever if they don't go bankrupt, merge, or get acquired. That leads to that fourth point down there. So let's skip the separation of ownership and management. That fourth point, transfer of ownership is pretty easy, right? If you want to transfer your ownership in this company, then you just have to go out on the stock market and sell it, right? So they're very liquid, usually very liquid stock shares within a company, and this makes transfer of ownership very easy. It's very easy to buy into a company, become an owner, very easy to sell that and no longer be a part of the company. And we've already talked about the last point, easier to raise capital. That's actually the most important point in my perspective, because that's one of the main reasons you'd want to become a corporation. But let's talk for a second about the separation of ownership and management. Now this is a very interesting issue because as you see that double-sided arrow, this comes up as an advantage and a disadvantage. And what we mean here is that there is the opportunity for both an advantage and a disadvantage. From an advantageous standpoint, the shareholders don't have to run the company, right? And I might not necessarily be a wonderful CEO of Microsoft. I don't know a whole lot about technology, at least not into that standpoint, not to that degree. So you can actually have managers that know what they're doing running the firm, and owners standing back and allowing them to do a much better job than those owners could do if they were managing the company. So a separation of duties, which can sometimes be good. However, a separation of duties can sometimes be bad, and this gets us to the idea of an agency problem, which we may talk about more in this class. But an agency problem happens when the owners want the company to go one way and the managers want it to go another, and the managers thus do so in their own best interest. For example, maybe giving themselves a raise when they don't need it. This happens sometimes even from a macro standpoint in the government. Take a look at Congress and see what some of the financial packages that they vote for themselves, such as really nice insurance, right? Let's just say they don't go and get your most basic Obamacare package. They also can when they want to raise, they vote for it, right? Who's not going to vote for that? So they've given themselves some pretty impressive salaries, and then they've also voted that those salaries should last for the rest of their life, regardless of whether or not they remain in office or not. So there's agency problems do exist, and they can be a major issue, and we will get to them in more detail later in this class. Now, the most obvious disadvantage in my mind is double taxation. Unlike a sole proprietorship or a partnership, corporations can be double taxed, meaning the income that a corporation receives can be taxed, so corporations can be taxed, and then also your personal income that you receive from the company can be taxed. Now, the income that you would receive from a corporation is usually just through dividends, and dividends can be qualified or not qualified. There's a lot of different rules around here, but still the idea remains the same, that you are being double taxed, once at the corporate level and once at the personal level, and this can be the worst part or the most significant disadvantage for a corporation. Now, if there is one disadvantage that I've kind of left off this slide, it's more obvious than anything else, but we could also write down that corporations are usually more complicated. There's a lot more paperwork, there's a lot more filing that has to be involved, and throughout time we tend to create new and more confusing and more burdensome regulations. So to prepare articles of incorporation, that's obviously a lot harder than just to get a business license and to start a company. So starting a corporation is much more difficult than starting a sole proprietorship. But also, just running a corporation is going to be a lot more burdensome, and that is why they have to hire accountants, and they're going to have auditors, and they're going to have a lot of different people involved in making sure that all of the paperwork is done correctly. From an international perspective, there's also a couple different types of companies. This is not that important for like a test, but just to expose you to some of these. One of them would be a joint stock company. A good example here is Sweden's Volvo. Another international corporate form is public limited companies. A good example here would be maybe the Rolls-Royce in the United Kingdom, Fiat in Italy. And then we mentioned before LLCs, limited liability companies. Well, there are different types of LLCs. In America, one of the things that we discuss quite a bit about LLCs is that they are a specific type of a corporation. So they're going to have limited liability, but there are going to be some rules that separate them from a regular corporation. Well, there's also some rules that are going to separate an American LLC from an international LLC. One company that is an LLC internationally is in the Netherlands. You have Unilever. Unilever, by the way, if you've never heard of that company, is kind of like Johnson & Johnson and Procter & Gamble. Now, all of those different types of international corporate forms have some unique differences, and it's not important that you know them, but I would like you to know that they all share public ownership and limited liability. Those are two kind of traits that you see in any type of corporation. Now, to switch gears for a second, let's talk about the goal of financial management. What should be the goal of a corporation? Let's say you are the boss. Okay, you are the CFO or the CEO. What should your goal be as the head financial manager? This is usually when I would have a student in the class raise their hand and say, I think the goal should be to survive. Well, I question them as to whether or not they have to even make a profit then. I mean, if your goal is just simply to survive, you can take almost no risk and just kind of stay the same size and maybe never even really even make a profit, but just kind of make sure that the doors remain open. I think most students see that can't be the main goal of a company. Well, another student might say, what about avoiding bankruptcy? And I said, well, that's very similar, in my opinion, as to surviving. Uh, at what cost would you go to avoid bankruptcy? For example, what if you need to declare bankruptcy simply to reorganize because due to different amounts of union involvement in your company, you can no longer make the financial obligations to the pension funds for your employees. And so it's either we go bankrupt now and reorganize, or we go bankrupt later and we liquidate. So avoiding bankruptcy should not necessarily be the first goal either. What if another student said, let's beat the competition? Well, that sounds pretty good. But who is the competition? What if there is no competition? I mean, what if you are Facebook? I mean, there's no MySpace anymore. What if you are Walmart? Is your goal to beat the competition? You're already beating them. So don't you think you need to have another goal? If you're a mom and pop store that sells kind of the same stuff as Walmart, do you really think you're going to beat Walmart? So beating the competition is not necessarily the best strategy either. Sometimes, like I said, there can either be no competition or you can't even beat the competition, even if you tried. So let's look at some of the points I pointed out here. What about maximize profit? You heard me mention profit just a second ago. That sounds good, right? Well, maximizing profit is often cited, but the problem with it is it's not very precise. And what I mean by that is, are we trying to maximize profit in the short term, or are we trying to maximize it in the long term? If we're trying to maximize it in the short term, then I'll just make sure that I pay no bonuses this year to any of my employees, and that will just make my profits go straight up for maybe 1 year. But then once they find out they don't get those bonuses and they all quit and I lose all my best employees, then I'm really not maximizing my profits for the long term. Now, if I want to maximize my profits for the long term, am I sacrificing too much in the short term? And what does long term mean? I mean, how long are we talking about? Because, to be honest, if we keep going further and further into the long term, you and I and everyone else, we're all going to be dead. So there has to be a little bit more definition so that we can be a little bit more precise. Okay, how about let's just say minimize cost? Well, once again, this is not that precise either, because I could start making my products cheaper. If I was a pizza company, I could start making my pizzas with less fresh ingredients. Maybe I would give smaller ingredients, and get away with maybe trying to give them instead of circle pepperonis, I'm going to go with triangle pepperonis. Regardless of what you do to minimize cost, it could hurt your reputation. And once again, this becomes a short-term versus long-term deal. In the short term, yes, you could probably increase your profits by minimizing your costs. But in the long term, if it's not done well, this could really hurt your reputation or brand within your company. What about maximize market share? Well, this gets back to this idea of whether or not you should be trying to compete uh, with other people or beat the competition. But seriously, I mean, you want to talk about minimizing costs and maximizing market share? Well, just give your product away for free. Okay, you give pizza away for free, and you'll get every student UTC there, right? That's how we get you to go to all the club meetings. However, it makes sense that that's not a good way to make a lot of money, right? So this brings us to the answer, and this is one of the most important ideas in this class, and obviously it'll be on your first exam. The number one goal of the main financial manager, right? The number one goal for a firm is to maximize the stock price, okay? So I can read that to you the way it's written on the slide. Maximize the current value per share of the company's existing stock. But what we're saying is we want to maximize the stock price for that company, okay? Another way of saying that is maximize the market value of the existing owner's equity. That's just saying instead of the stock price, look at the owner's equity. The owner's equity is nothing more than the stock price times the number of owners or the number of shares outstanding. So either way you want to say that, it's really about maximizing the stock price. So make sure that you know that. The number one goal of a corporation is to maximize the stock price. Now, does that mean that we should do anything we can to increase or maximize the stock price? Um, should we even consider engaging in illegal or unethical behavior, maybe going into that gray territory? Well, this is a really important question to ask yourself, and this gets into a lot of the ethical discussions that you would have in any ethics class or that you will have among employees in the future. One of the major issues that the United States has had to deal with is outsourcing, right? There was a whole lot of industry up in the Detroit and in the Midwest, and actually throughout the United States. As they started looking for cheaper areas to go to, you will see that some of them drifted into states that were um, less involved with unions. Um, and they eventually drifted even into Mexico and down over to China and into some of the other Asian countries for uh, industry manufacturing. And now we're eventually probably going to move towards robots. So everything that is in one of those countries may eventually shift back to the United States. Outsourcing is in some ways done because your goal is to maximize the shareholders' value or the stock price for the company. However, at what cost? Meaning, is it ethical to fire workers because there are cheaper workers elsewhere? So one of the things you have to decide is the ethics involved and in doing the right thing. It could be. I mean, if you're telling them, hey, we got to let some of you go so that we can keep this company here in this town because this town depends on it, that sounds ethical. And if that's the truth, then maybe that is the right decision to make. Or maybe you've got to do this because this is what your shareholders require. If you don't do this, your company is gonna be able not to be able to compete as well in the marketplace. So sometimes outsourcing is actually the right choice to make. You also need to consider branding issues. If you make too big of a move, is there going to be public backlash? And then would there be boycotts against your product or strikes within the company? So outsourcing is one of those 50 shades of gray questions, right? Now, offshoring is probably less gray and more black, but in some of these situations, a company is going to do their best to put assets in tax-friendly areas. So a Caribbean island or another country somewhere that has more tax-friendly laws. Now, is it ethical for companies that were started in the United States, big tech companies, to then try to switch where they are headquartered so that they don't have to pay the very high corporate taxes that we have in the United States? Or can they do other accounting maneuvers to where they just pay less. And so offshoring is one of those issues that is probably good for the shareholders, but it is trying to avoid maybe the tax-paying duty of corporations within the United States. So, where should a financial manager place their loyalties? And so that's one of the things where you have somewhat of a gray territory with offshoring. You can also have plain fraud. Enron is an example of that. So I would say Enron is well in the black. There's not a lot of black and white to be discussed. They're pretty much all black. I wouldn't even say there's very much gray to be discussed. What Enron did was they committed fraud, and they not only hurt all their employees and all their customers, but they hurt a lot of the other companies that did business with them. So, there I put Enron on up here just to let people know that you can push this way too far. And Enron had their stock price shoot way up, but they did it in a very unethical manner, and eventually it was discovered, the fraud was discovered, and the entire company collapsed too. So when we say maximize share price, we mean do so in an ethical manner. What about corporate supported charities? I've done a lot of research into socially responsible investing, which is investing in companies that have some kind of social aspect for them. They have very good corporate governance policies, meaning that they're really good to their employees, like a Google or a Microsoft. Maybe they're very green and they give back. I know Disney likes to do a lot of these initiatives and like running their trains in their parks off of, kitchen grease and things of that nature. When it comes to charities, do you want your company to support those charities, and is that a good idea? Well, maybe, maybe not. It could be good for the world, it could be good for your country, it could be good for that local area. It could also be good for the business if they get some kind of like a reputational benefit. If that perception somehow affects the bottom line and increases the stock price. Let me ask you one question. Who do you think gives more money on an annual basis to charities than any other company? Now, just off the top of your head, you may say a company like Microsoft, right? Bill Gates is pledging to give up most of his personal wealth. I think a lot of people might be a little bit shocked to hear that answer is Walmart, and it's almost always Walmart. I think there's maybe 1 year in the last decade or so that Walmart wasn't the company that gave the most money to charity, and usually by a pretty large margin. Okay, so does Walmart actually get a good reputational benefit from this? I would argue no, because Walmart is one of the companies that's usually most often criticized for how it pays its employees, how it treats women, corporate governance issues. You could just name pretty much all of them, right? So, how you support charities and how you advertise that, I would think Walmart should do a better job of advertising that they are usually the company that gives away the most money. Now, a caveat to that argument also is Walmart makes a ton of money. So what you would like to look at is, let's try to see which companies give the most amount or highest percentage of their profits to charity, right? So you can also bring up that as a topic of discussion too. Speaking of ethical decisions for a company, the United States actually took some of this out of the company's hands by creating the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002. Now, this came on the heels of several big scandals. Enron was probably the most emphasized in the media, but there was also Tyco, WorldCom, Adelphia, and others. Now, the main thing I want you to remember about Sarbanes-Oxley Act is this is intended to strengthen protection against accounting fraud and financial malpractice. What does that mean? Well, basically, the goal of this act was to make companies tell the truth. In other words, officers would have to review and sign all annual reports, and then they would be responsible for the accuracy of those financial statements. So, from an advantageous standpoint, this was a very good act that was focused on, making people tell the truth. However, compliance with this act was also very costly. Some firms were driven to go public outside the United States, so this is kind of getting back to offshoring. Some other companies decided to go dark, right? So they bought back all their shares so that they were no longer a public company. They're a private company, and now they don't have to report the way that they would have if they were a public company. So in some ways, we actually made public disclosure worse, right? But most, I think, economists and a lot of other business professionals realized that this act was probably necessary. We needed a way to make sure that the people at the top were, that the buck stopped there, that they signed off on all the financial documents and said, we are telling the truth about our financial structure and what revenues and profits that we made within the last year. So, although there were a few companies like Pronotex Technology, which created fuel cells in Massachusetts, um, that decided to leave the United States and go public on, say, like the London Stock Exchange instead. Most of the companies stayed right where they are. Most of them complied to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and although it does cost more money from an accounting perspective, this does create a sense of certainty within the market, which will usually increase investor participation. Another discussion we need to have when discussing ethics is the agency problem. Now, the agency relationship is when a principal, like the shareholders or board of directors, hires an agent, like a manager, to represent its interests. So, remembering here that the stockholders would be the principals and that the managers would be the agents, this specific situation happens in finance because a lot of the times um, the manager is looking out for the manager, not necessarily for the shareholder, even though the number one goal of any firm should be to increase the stock price. One of the most common examples of a manager looking out for themselves is when they give them a larger bonus than what they probably should have received. I do remember from my time at AmSouth that the year before AmSouth merged with Regions, which is two companies, two banks in Birmingham, Alabama, that the before the merger was announced, there was an announcement that no one was receiving bonuses at AmSouth that year. Well, after the merger, and a lot of employees quit because they were very frustrated that they didn't get their bonus. Well, after the merger, it became obvious that AmSouth really wasn't too concerned with how many people quit because they were going to have to get rid of some people after the merger anyway. And Dowd Ritter, the president of AmSouth, who somehow also now became the president of Regions Bank after the merger with AmSouth and Regions, received a very large bonus. So I think a lot of employees were very frustrated with that situation, and that might not necessarily have been what was in the best interest of the company long term when a lot of their really good employees left. So you have to look at stock price, and you have to look at what might happen to other stakeholders like employees within the company. A lot of times the managers are really just concerned with themselves. Another situation that often happens that's maybe not discussed as often is that the managers are really good at protecting themselves too. So they don't want the company to be bought out and for them to lose their jobs. So they may create some language that protects them so that if they get bought out that they're paid millions of dollars, or what they call golden parachutes that allow them to kind of drift off into paradise. You see this sometimes with contracts with big football coaches. You can't get rid of them just after 1 year. You're going to have to pay them their whole contract or whatnot, and that might not necessarily be in the interest of a university. And it might also be. That might be just some of the legal language that you have to put in to secure a good coach. Nonetheless, there are a lot of agency costs that can arise within a company, and we will talk about more of those throughout the class. Now, although there are several issues we can discuss with agency costs, I think one of the most important things is how do we control it? Well, how would you? How would you, if you were a shareholder, try to control a manager and make sure that they did what was in your best interest? Well, one of the most common ways is through what we call incentives, or restructuring a financial package for a manager so that their interests align with the shareholders' interests. One of the most common ways of doing this is to give them stock options, right? Because if you give them stock options now, they are also an owner, so it's in their best interest to do what's in the best interest of the owners. Another thing that you can often see done is if you receive part of your salary based on compensation, right? So if you think about a waiter that has to get tips, think about a manager, usually like a sales manager that might receive compensation based on not just the flat salary, but maybe on how much revenue they created that quarter or that year. So you could see something like maybe a flat salary versus a salary that was half flat, half compensation. This also doesn't have to stop, meaning the incentives don't have to stop just with the main CEO or CFO. I mean, usually there are incentive packages created for a lot of the top officers in a company, and now you even see incentives being offered to just about every employee. I know that when I worked at AmSouth Bank that I immediately received $2,000 worth of AmSouth stock as soon as I was hired. And of course, I sold that as quickly as I could just because I needed the cash. But if I'd have kept it, that would have allowed me to have a little bit more of an interest in what happened with AmSouth. Google made a lot of publicity when it issued stock options to all 16,000 employees. So is that a good thing? Well, I mean, it really creates this idea that everybody in the company wants to see the company's stock price do well. And so I do believe that in Google's, for Google, which is a company that grows very quite rapidly, that this could create a sense of momentum and a sense of desire for everybody to work it for the best interest of the company. Now, if we get back to this idea of agency conflicts, one of the things that we could also discuss is corporate control. Some people argue that a threat of a takeover might result in better management, meaning if somebody could come over, if somebody likes a company but thinks that it's got poor management, they may want to buy them out and get rid of the managers. And that makes a lot of sense. So that could be good or it could be bad. And one of the things that might make it bad is what is in the language that would really hurt a stock price of a company. So if there's a lot of protective mechanisms in store, then this might not actually have the shareholders rewarded, meaning that management might actually want to be taken over. So in a good situation, it would just make the managers work harder, but in a bad situation, they may know they're protected with the golden parachutes that we discussed earlier. There could be also poison pills within the contracts. A poison pill, by the way, is nothing more than something written into the contract that would really hurt the stock price if it went through. So, for example, that the company stock price would be sold really, really, really cheap to employees or to somebody else before the transaction could take place, or that maybe something else is in there that would really result in making the transition much less cost efficient for the person that or company that wants to take over the company. There's also white knights, so a company, if they know that there's somebody else that could come in and save them. So, for example, if Walmart wanted to buy a company out, but this company knew that Target might come in and save them and they would prefer to be taken over by Target, then that would be a white knight situation. But nonetheless, there are corporate control issues. One of the biggest corporate control issues to worry about is a proxy fight. For example, when Microsoft considered buying out Yahoo, they made a $42 billion offer. Now, at that time, that was 62% higher than the current stock price for Yahoo. Now, Yahoo spent $79 million just to try to fight from being taken over by Microsoft. They probably should have been taken over by Microsoft, right? Microsoft instead walked away and created the search engine Bing, right? Yahoo is kind of just drifted around, and who knows what might become of them. But there's a lot of people that suspect that what was in the best interest of the shareholders would have been to be bought out by Microsoft. However, those managers probably didn't want to lose their jobs, right? So they fought that very, very hard. In fact, 3 years after the Yahoo offer, Yahoo's market cap was valued at $22.3 billion. So that was about half of what Microsoft had originally offered for the company. So there's a lot of issues between managers and the stockholders. There's also stakeholders to consider. Now, make sure that you understand stakeholders are not necessarily stockholders. Stakeholders are anybody that has a stake in the company. They could be the stockholders, but there's also employees, there's customers, there's suppliers, even the government might have a stake in that company, right? So, if you think about our military, there are certain companies like Boeing that we actually rely quite a bit on. So, there are a lot of stakeholders usually involved in major corporations. Switching gears just a little bit, if you're wanting to find some information on these companies, you can also obviously use the internet. Now, there are a lot of websites, and if you're really into this, just let me know. Send me an email, and I can send you a complete reading list of different areas that you can go to get information. But one of the basic areas to start is financeyahoo.com. Morningstar can give you some information as well. There's a lot of excellent websites. Motley Fool or Fool.com is a website that I really like to read articles from too. But you can look at the Wall Street Journal. There's a lot of different ways to get some information. If you're going to look up specific companies, sometimes it's easier if you learn the ticker. So, for example, Southwest Airlines has the ticker LUV for love. Harley Davidson has the ticker HOG for hog. Starwood Hotels and Resorts has the ticker HOT hot, and American Express has the ticker AXP. All of these companies have unique tickers, and if you will plug those tickers into Google or in anything, you'll get specific financial information for these firms. So this information that you could be looking for is not just the current stock price for buying it, but you might be able to find specific ratios that we'll talk about later in class, like the PE ratio, PEG, price to book, on and on. You could read news, see opinions, look at specific type of portfolio situations, get some personal financial advice, or even if you wanted to track that stock performance. So there's quite a bit of information there online if you really want to go and find it. Switching gears one more time, I want to talk to you a little bit about cash flows between the firm and the financial markets. Understanding cash flows is really one of the main jobs of a financial manager. Now, if you look, you can see that although this graph is pretty complicated, if you'll spend some time looking at it, it does kind of help you understand how cash might flow from one area of the market to another. So let's take a real quick time and look. If you look here, the first step, or step A, this is all about getting cash, right? So firms are going to issue securities to get some cash. So they'll usually do this through an IPO, which is an initial public offering to raise equity. They might get a loan or something of that nature, but this is usually about issuing securities. And then the next step is that they're going to have to buy something to get the company started. Now might be less involved if it's a tech company, but if you're a manufacturing company, you're usually going to buy some, plant, property, and equipment. So step 2 is to buy assets. Then if you go to step 3, you got to make some money, right? So the next job is obviously to make cash. Step 4 is then you got to spend this cash in a variety of ways. You're going to have to pay debt, pay taxes, pay dividends, or reinvest that money back in the company. And so step 4 is actually, D, E, and F, right? What do you do with that money once you make it, right? So if you look at D, that's going to be paying taxes, or maybe debt to bondholders. If you look at E, you're talking about reinvesting that money back in the company to make it grow. And if you're looking at F, you're looking at paying out those dividends to the shareholders, right? So once the money's made, you got to figure out where it goes. This is, although it looks somewhat confusing from a graph standpoint, if you follow it, I think it gives you just maybe a little bit of idea of where all the money flows. Another good way of looking at this, though, in my opinion, is looking at a net income statement. So when we get to net income statement, if this slide confused you, just forget it and just focus on the net income statement. Now, as far as getting a company started, you one of the first things you might do is try to sell some stock. Now, how would you do that? So if you look back at that slide about cash flows between the firm and the financial markets, your goal is first to get some money. If you're not going to do a loan, then you do need to create an IPO. Now, not anybody can just go out and create an IPO. The SEC has a lot of rules, and usually there is an investment bank or some other company involved in specializing or underwriting the necessary documents to get that IPO going. That's why, for example, if you looked at Social Network, that Facebook went to a major bank to help them get some money to grow the business, right? And then eventually, which is outside of the movie, but eventually this company even went public, right? It takes a lot of other players involved usually to get through all the accounting, legal, and selling costs involved with creating an IPO. Those costs can be, enormous, so to speak. So the primary market for an IPO usually doesn't involve like the regular investor. IPOs usually involve big players, big banks, investment firms, whatnot, and then those companies or banks will turn around and sell the money on a secondary market, which is your traditional stock exchanges. Two of the most important stock exchanges for knowing this class are the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, or the National Association of Security Dealers Automated Quotation System. So you can just remember NASDAQ, you don't have to have that memorized. The NASDAQ has twice as many corporations as the New York Stock Exchange, but far less overall value. A lot of the big companies are on the New York Stock Exchange. So, if you're kind of confused about the slide, the main things to remember is that the primary market, their goal is really to raise cash. So this is where, a company is trying to raise cash, may go to a bank or a mutual fund or an insurance company, some big companies that have a lot of money that they could invest, and then those companies will then turn around and sell it on the secondary market. So the secondary market's really about one owner trying to sell to another owner on a stock exchange. Finally, in this lecture, I've added just a quick quiz to kind of remind you of some of the things that we discussed in lecture 1.1 and now in lecture 1.2. These are some of the major questions to answer, and if you can do so, then you should be well on your way of understanding the first two lectures for this class.